Hello and welcome to this new video. Before we begin, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how these stories reach people all around the world. Now let's get started. The history of soap from ancient waters to modern cleanliness. We take it for granted today, the simple act of washing with soap. We lather, rinse, and emerge clean, our skin free of dirt and oil, smelling of lavender or mint, or nothing at all. But for most of human history, this experience would have been unimaginable luxury or simply impossible. This is the story of how humans learned to clean themselves, what they smelled like before and after, and how the pursuit of cleanliness shaped civilization itself. Prehistoric times, water and abrasion. 100,000 ploys. Years ago, long before soap, before even the concept of deliberate cleaning, early humans had water, rivers, lakes, streams. These were humanity's first and most basic cleaning tool. But water alone doesn't remove oils and fats from skin. It can rinse away loose dirt and debris, but the natural oils our skin produces, mixed with sweat and environmental grime, cling stubbornly. Early humans likely smelled quite strongly by modern standards, a mixture of body odor from sweat, smoke from fires, animal blood, and fat from hunting and butchering, earth and vegetation. This wasn't necessarily unpleasant to them. It was simply how humans smelled. Our ancestors had the same scent glands we do, producing sweat and oils, but without any means to remove them beyond occasional immersion in water. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans used abrasive materials for cleaning: sand, clay, and rough stones. Sand could be rubbed on skin to scrub away dirt through physical friction. Clay, particularly certain types like fuller's earth or bentonite, has natural absorptive properties. When rubbed on skin or hair, clay absorbs oils and can be rinsed away, taking some of the grease with it. Imagine the process. A person would wade into a stream, scoop up sand from the bottom, and vigorously scrub their skin. The sand would physically dislodge dirt and dead skin cells. The water would rinse away the loosened particles. The person would emerge cleaner than before, though still with their natural body oils largely intact. They might smell less of accumulated sweat and dirt, but still distinctly of human, a scent we might find strong today, but which would have been normal and expected then. Clay was more effective. Certain clays, when wet and rubbed on skin, would absorb oils like a sponge. The Egyptians, much later, would formalize this practice, but prehistoric humans likely discovered it independently, noticing that after handling certain types of wet clay, their hands felt cleaner, less greasy. In colder climates, where water was scarce or freezing, cleaning was even more challenging. Arctic and subarctic peoples developed other techniques, scraping skin with bone or stone tools to remove accumulated oils and dirt, using snow when available to rub on skin for a kind of cold cleaning. The Inuit used rendered seal fat as a kind of cleanser, fighting fat with fat, using fresh oils to dissolve old ones, then scraping both away. Ancient Mesopotamia, 2800 BCE. The first soap-like substances. The first evidence of soap-like substances comes from ancient Babylon around 2800 BCE. Clay tablets discovered by archaeologists describe a mixture of water, alkali, and cassia oil, a formula that, while not quite soap as we know it, represented a revolutionary understanding that certain substances could break down oils and fats in ways water alone could not. Mesopotamian soap was made from ash and animal fats. The process, though they didn't understand the chemistry, was essentially creating a basic form of soap through saponification, the chemical reaction between fats and alkalis. Here's how it was made. Wood ash was collected from fires and mixed with water. The water would leach out alkali compounds, primarily potassium carbonate, from the ash, creating a caustic solution called lye water. This lye water was then mixed with animal fats, tallow from cattle or sheep, rendered down from butchering. When mixed and heated together, the alkali in the ash water would react with the fats, breaking down the fat molecules into soap, a substance that has one end attracted to water and one end attracted to oils. This unique property allows soap to surround oil and grease, allowing water to wash them away. The result was a paste or jelly-like substance, greyish or brownish in colour, with a strong alkaline smell, harsh and chemical, nothing like the perfumed soaps we know today. This early soap was primarily used not for bathing, but for cleaning wool and cotton textiles, preparing them for dyeing or trade. However, there's evidence that Mesopotamians also used these cleaning compounds for personal hygiene, though likely only among the wealthy. A person washing with this early soap would experience a strange, slippery feeling as the soap emulsified their skin oils. The soap was harsh, the pH was highly alkaline, potentially irritating to skin. But it worked. After washing and rinsing the person's skin would feel genuinely clean, in a way water alone could never achieve. Squeaky clean. We'd say as soap literally squeaks when rubbed on truly clean skin due to increased friction from removed oils. The smell after washing would be distinct, less of accumulated body odor, but carrying the sharp, acrid smell of the lye used in the soap's making. To our modern noses, they might smell like a combination of clean skin and wood smoke with an underlying chemical tang. Certainly cleaner than before, but not the neutral or pleasantly scented cleanliness we expect today. Only the wealthy could afford such cleaning compounds. The poor, the vast majority, continued to rely on water and perhaps occasional use of sand or clay. The scent difference between social classes was noticeable and significant. Wealthy Mesopotamians who could afford regular use of cleaning compounds would smell distinctly less pungent than laborers who worked all day in the sun with only occasional water to rinse off. This class divide in cleanliness established a pattern that would persist throughout history. Cleanliness as a marker of wealth and status. The ability to smell clean, to present oneself without the odor of labor and poverty, became associated with higher social standing. In Mesopotamian society, where social hierarchy was rigid and divinely ordained, this smell difference reinforced existing power structures. The wealthy didn't just look different, they smelled different, and this sensory distinction marked them as belonging to a superior class. Ancient Egypt, 2000 BCE, natron, oils, and the pursuit of purity. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness, driven both by practical concerns. The hot climate encouraged frequent washing and religious beliefs that associated physical purity with spiritual worthiness. They developed sophisticated cleaning practices that went beyond simple soap. Natron was Egypt's cleaning miracle. This naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate was mined from dry lake beds throughout Egypt. It's mildly alkaline and has excellent cleaning and deodorizing properties. Egyptians used it for everything, cleaning the body, cleaning the home, and famously for mummification. To use natron for washing, Egyptians would make a paste by mixing the powdered mineral with water. This paste was rubbed over the body, where its alkalinity would help break down oils, and its mild abrasive texture would scrub away dirt. It was much gentler than Mesopotamian soap, less likely to irritate skin, but still effective. After scrubbing with natron, Egyptians would rinse in water, often from the Nile or from bathing pools in wealthy homes. They would then apply oils, not for cleaning, but for protection. The hot, dry Egyptian climate was harsh on skin. After the alkaline natron had stripped away natural oils, replacement was necessary to prevent skin from drying out and cracking. These weren't simple oils, but carefully prepared unguents, perfumed mixtures of castor oil, olive oil, almond oil mixed with frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, or lotus flower extracts. The wealthy had access to dozens of different oil preparations for different purposes, some for hair, some for body, some for specific skin conditions. How did an Egyptian smell after this cleansing ritual? First, noticeably cleaner than before, the natron would have neutralized much of the bacterial activity that causes body odor, then distinctly perfumed with whatever oils they applied. A wealthy Egyptian might smell of myrrh and lotus, cinnamon and almond oil, exotic and pleasant, masking any remaining body odor with strong, lasting fragrances. But this was exclusively for the elite. The perfumed oils alone were expensive, often imported from distant lands. Common Egyptians might use natron when they could afford or access it, but oils were a luxury. They might use cheaper alternatives, animal fats, simpler plant oils, or nothing at all, letting their skin dry out and crack in the harsh climate. The smell difference between a perfumed noble and a laborer was stark. Nobles smelled of expensive imported fragrances. Laborers working in fields under the hot sun or in workshops, quarries, and construction sites smelled of sweat, dust, and human toil. Even after washing with water and perhaps natron, without the protective and perfuming oils, they would quickly return to smelling of work. Cleanliness in Egypt had profound religious dimensions that intertwined with social hierarchy. Priests purified themselves multiple times daily, washing before entering temples or performing rituals. This wasn't just about removing dirt, but about spiritual preparation, making oneself worthy to approach the gods. The elaborate cleansing rituals, the use of natron and oils, the specific prayers said during washing, all emphasized that cleanliness was next to godliness, literally. Egyptian religious texts are explicit about this connection. The negative confession from the Book of the Dead, where the deceased declares their purity before entering the afterlife, includes statements about physical cleanliness alongside moral purity. I am pure, I am pure, I am pure, I am pure. This phrase appears repeatedly, linking ritual washing with spiritual worthiness. Priests had to maintain extraordinary standards of cleanliness. They shaved their entire bodies every few days to remove any hair that might harbor impurity. They washed multiple times daily in sacred pools. They wore only pure white linen that was washed after each wearing. They abstained from certain foods considered unclean. This regime of purity set priests apart from ordinary Egyptians, marking them as holy through their cleanliness. This religious association with cleanliness created a moral dimension to hygiene. To be clean was to be spiritually pure, morally upright, and closer to the divine. To be dirty was to be impure, morally suspect, and distant from the gods. This wasn't just metaphorical. Egyptians truly believed that physical cleanliness affected spiritual state. The social implications were significant. The wealthy, who could afford elaborate cleaning rituals and perfumed oils, could demonstrate their moral and spiritual superiority through their cleanliness. The poor, unable to achieve these standards, were implicitly marked as less pure, less worthy. This religious framework justified social inequality. The wealthy weren't just richer, they were cleaner, and therefore more spiritually elevated. This pattern, cleanliness as simultaneously religious practice, moral virtue, and class marker, would echo through history, appearing in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and other religions, always linking physical washing with moral purity and often reinforcing social hierarchies in the process. Ancient Greece and Rome, 500 BCE to 400 CE. The bath as social institution. The Greeks and Romans took bathing to an entirely new level, not just as personal hygiene, but as social institution, public architecture, and cultural practice. The Roman baths, in particular, represent perhaps the most elaborate bathing culture in human history before the modern era. Greeks used a substance called strigil, actually not a substance but a tool. After exercising at the gymnasium, done naked, as Greeks considered nudity natural and beautiful, athletes would apply olive oil to their skin. This oil would mix with sweat and dirt accumulated during exercise. Then, using a curved metal scraper called a strigil, they would scrape off the oil, sweat, and dirt mixture. This was remarkably effective. The oil dissolves and loosens body oils and dirt, and the scraping physically removes it. Ancient Greek athletes would emerge with skin that was very clean, though shiny with residual olive oil. They smelled primarily of olive oil, a clean, if somewhat greasy scent. Certainly preferable to sweat and dirt, and the antioxidants in olive oil were actually good for skin health. But the strigil method had limitations. It required help to reach one's back, and it didn't clean hair effectively. It was primarily an after-exercise practice, not complete bathing. Romans developed far more elaborate bathing practices. Roman baths, thermae, were massive public buildings with multiple rooms: the caldarium, hot bath, tepidarium, warm bath, and frigidarium, cold bath, along with areas for exercise, socializing, and sometimes libraries or gardens. Romans used a cleaning compound called sapo, which they adopted from Celtic and Germanic tribes. Sapo was made from animal fat and wood ashes, essentially true soap, similar to Mesopotamian versions, but refined over centuries. The Romans characteristically improved on what they borrowed. The bathing process was elaborate. First, a Roman might exercise or visit the sauna like laconicum. Sweating would open pores and loosen dirt. Then they'd move to the caldarium, a hot room with hot water pools. The heat and humidity further loosened dirt and oils. An attendant or the bather themselves would apply olive oil mixed with pumice powder, ground volcanic stone. This combination provided both oil to dissolve body oils and abrasive pumice to scrub. The mixture was worked into the skin, then scraped away with a strigil, just like the Greeks. Next came actual washing with sapo. The soap would be applied and worked into a lather. Romans understood that lather helped distribute soap and increase contact with dirt. After lathering, they'd rinse in the warm waters of the tepidarium, then plunge into the cold waters of the frigidarium. This cold plunge closed pores and was believed to invigorate the body. After bathing, Romans would apply perfumed oils. Roman perfumery was highly developed. Oils scented with rose, violet, saffron, nard, and dozens of other essences. The wealthy would be massaged with these oils by trained slaves, emerging from the baths not just clean, but perfumed, relaxed, and pampered. How did a Roman smell after this elaborate process? Remarkably clean, by any standard. The combination of heat, oil, soap, scraping, and rinsing removed virtually all body oils, sweat, and dirt. The perfumed oils applied afterward meant Romans smelled distinctly of whatever scent they preferred, rose being particularly popular, along with violet and various spice-based perfumes. Compare this to a modern person after showering with commercial soap and shampoo. The Roman might actually smell more strongly perfumed, as Roman oils were concentrated and long-lasting, but the underlying cleanliness would be similar. However, this was the experience of Romans wealthy enough to afford bath admission and oils. The very poor might use public baths occasionally when they could afford the small entrance fee, but without the oils and elaborate process. They'd emerge clean, but would quickly smell of sweat again without the protective oil layer. And of course, this was urban Roman culture. Rural peasants, slaves working in fields or mines, people in provinces far from major cities. They had access to nothing like this. They washed in streams or with buckets of cold water, perhaps with some ash-based soap if they could make it, but more often with just water. Their smell would be markedly different, stronger, more of actual human body odor, less masked by perfumes. The class divide in smell was significant and deliberately maintained. A Roman senator bathing daily at the thermae, perfumed with expensive imported oils, would smell radically different from a field slave who washed weekly at best in cold water with no soap. This smell difference reinforced social hierarchies. You could literally smell someone's social class. But Roman bathing culture also had democratizing elements that complicated these class divisions. The public baths were accessible to citizens of varying wealth. Entrance fees were low, subsidized by wealthy patrons or the state. A modest shopkeeper could bathe in the same facilities as a wealthy merchant, though not at the same level of luxury. This created a shared experience across some class boundaries, a common ritual that united Romans. Cleanliness became associated with Roman civilization itself, intertwined with notions of cultural and moral superiority. Romans viewed bathing as a marker of civilization, distinguishing themselves from barbarians who they claimed didn't wash. This wasn't entirely accurate. Many Germanic and Celtic tribes had their own bathing practices, but it became part of Roman identity and imperial ideology. To be Roman was to bathe, to be clean, to be cultured. This association linked cleanliness with civilization, morality, and imperial power. When Romans conquered new territories, they built baths, spreading their bathing culture as part of Romanization. The baths weren't just about hygiene, they were about imposing Roman values, Roman social structures, and Roman identity. The moral dimension was explicit in Roman writings. Bathing wasn't just practical but virtuous, a sign of self-discipline, respect for one's body, and proper Roman behavior. To neglect bathing was seen as barbaric, slovenly, and morally suspect. This created social pressure to bathe regularly, reinforcing the practice across Roman society. Yet there was also Roman moralistic critique of excessive bathing luxury. Some philosophers and moralists warned that overly elaborate bathing practices, lengthy massages, and perfumed indulgence represented decadence and moral decay. They advocated for simple, quick washing as opposed to hours-long bathing sessions. This tension between cleanliness as virtue and luxury, bathing as vice, would persist through history. The Middle Ages, 500 to 1500 CE, the Great Unwashing. Popular history often portrays the Middle Ages as a time when Europeans stopped bathing, becoming filthy and disease-ridden. The truth is more complex. Bathing practices declined dramatically compared to Roman times, but people didn't stop cleaning themselves entirely. Practices varied by region, class, and period. The decline of public bathing had multiple causes. As the Roman Empire collapsed, the infrastructure maintaining the baths, aqueducts, heating systems, trained attendants, disappeared. The elaborate thermae fell into ruin. The knowledge of soap-making declined, though it never completely disappeared. Religious attitudes also shifted in ways that complicated cleanliness practices. Early Christianity inherited some Roman suspicion of public baths as places of immorality. They were associated with prostitution and pagan rituals. Some extreme ascetics embraced deliberate dirtiness as a form of mortification of the flesh, believing that denying the body comfort brought one closer to God. Saints were praised for never bathing, wearing hair shirts, and smelling of holy putrefaction. This holy filth tradition represented an inversion of Roman values. Where Romans associated cleanliness with virtue, some medieval Christians associated deliberate dirtiness with sanctity. St. Agnes supposedly never bathed in her entire life. St. Simeon Stylites, who lived atop a pillar for decades, was praised for the stench of his unwashed body and the maggots that fell from his sores. This wasn't just tolerated but celebrated as evidence of spiritual devotion. The more one neglected the flesh, the more one elevated the spirit. However, this extreme view wasn't universal or even majority. Most medieval people did wash, just less thoroughly and less frequently than Romans. The wealthy had access to wooden bathing tubs that could be filled with heated water. Bathing was an occasional event, perhaps monthly or for special occasions. But it happened. Medieval soap was made using similar methods to ancient soap, animal fats or plant oils mixed with alkali from wood ash. But quality varied enormously. Poor quality soap was harsh, irritating to skin, and didn't lather well. Good quality soap, made by skilled craftsmen in guilds, was expensive and primarily used for washing clothes rather than bodies. Aleppo's soap, made in Syria from olive oil and laurel oil mixed with lye, represented one of the finest soaps of the medieval period. It was mild, gentle on skin, and actually pleasant to use. But it was imported and expensive. Only the wealthy could afford it for regular use. Castle soap, made in Castile, Spain, from olive oil, became famous for its quality and purity. Castile soap was white or pale, much milder than animal fat soaps, and actually produced a reasonable lather. It was expensive but became the gold standard for quality soap in medieval Europe. Most people, however, used harsh tallow-based soap if they used soap at all, or simply washed with water. How did medieval people smell? It depended enormously on class and circumstance. A medieval peasant, working in fields, living in a one-room house, shared with animals, washing perhaps weekly in cold water with no soap, would smell strongly of body odor, smoke from the cooking fire, animals, earth, and sweat. Their clothes, worn continuously and washed rarely, would retain smells of sweat and dirt. To a modern nose, the smell would be very strong, a pungent mixture of human and animal. A merchant, or minor noble, might bathe monthly in a wooden tub with heated water, perhaps using soap, and would own multiple sets of clothing that were washed more regularly. They'd smell less pungent, but still distinctly of body odor between baths, especially in summer. After a bath, they might smell clean for a day or two before natural body oils and sweat accumulated again. The very wealthy had access to the best soaps, could bathe more frequently, used perfumes and pomanders, balls of solid perfume or spices worn or carried to mask odors. They would smell distinctly better than common folk, though still noticeably of body odor by modern standards, masked by whatever perfumes they used. The class distinctions in smell were stark and socially significant. The wealthy used their access to better hygiene and perfumes as markers of status. The ability to smell pleasant, or at least less offensive, became associated with nobility and virtue. Conversely, the strong smell of the laboring classes became associated with their lower status, reinforcing social hierarchies through sensory experience. Interestingly, public bathhouses existed throughout the medieval period in many European cities. These weren't like Roman baths in scale or sophistication, but they provided hot water bathing to those who could afford a small fee. However, they gained reputations as places of prostitution and disease, and many were shut down during periods of plague. Ironically, when bathing might have been most beneficial, medieval people used other cleaning methods beyond bathing. Linen undergarments, worn by those who could afford them, absorbed sweat and body oils and were washed regularly. Changing into clean linen was a form of cleaning by proxy. People would air out their outer clothes, brush them clean of dirt and lice, and change undergarments more frequently than they bathed their bodies. Hair was washed infrequently and often with mixtures of eggs, herbs, or even urine. The ammonia in stale urine is alkaline and can clean hair, though the smell is unpleasant until rinsed thoroughly. Some medieval hair washing recipes survive, including one using wood ash, lye, and herbs, essentially a harsh shampoo. Perfumes, when affordable, masked odors rather than replacing washing. Rose water, lavender water, herbal sachets in clothing, pomanders of cloves and other spices, all helped mask body odor without addressing its source. Islamic cultures during this period had very different hygiene practices, rooted in religious requirements. Islam mandates ritual washing, wudu before prayers, and Muslims pray 5 times daily. This meant regular washing of hands, face, and feet at minimum. Full body washing, ghusl, was required after certain activities. These religious requirements maintained a much higher standard of cleanliness than contemporary Christian Europe. The religious dimension was explicit and non-negotiable. Cleanliness wasn't optional or a matter of personal preference. It was a religious obligation necessary for prayer to be valid. This meant even poor Muslims maintained washing practices that wealthy Christians might neglect. The mosque included washing facilities ensuring access to clean water for ritual purification. Islamic bathhouses, hammams, continued the Roman bathing tradition in modified form. Hammams provided hot water, steam rooms, and social bathing spaces. Soap production continued and flourished in the Islamic world, with fine soaps made in Aleppo, Damascus, and other cities. A devout Muslim during the medieval period, washing 5 times daily and bathing weekly or more in a hammam using quality soap, would be dramatically cleaner than a contemporary European peasant. The smell difference would be significant. Less body odor, less accumulated dirt, masked by rosewater or other perfumes common in Islamic culture. This cleanliness wasn't just religious but cultural. Islamic culture valued cleanliness highly, seeing it as part of proper behavior and civilization. The contrast with Christian Europe, where some religious figures praised holy filth, was stark and deliberate. Islamic scholars and travelers wrote with disgust about the dirtiness of European Christians, seeing their neglect of washing as evidence of barbarism. Early modern period, 1500 to 1800. Cleanliness fluctuates. The early modern period saw contradictory trends in cleanliness. In some ways, bathing declined further. In others, soap-making improved, and new cleaning practices emerged. The Protestant Reformation complicated attitudes toward bathing. Some Protestant thinkers associated bathing with Catholic ritual and rejected it. Some emphasized spiritual purity over physical cleanliness. However, others promoted cleanliness as godliness, seeing physical order as reflecting moral order. The recurring plague outbreaks created fear of bathing. Medical theory of the time held that plague was spread through air, entering open pores. Bathing was thought to open pores, making one vulnerable to infection. Many people avoided bathing during plague years, believing it protective. This was tragically backward. Improved hygiene would have helped prevent plague spread, but contemporary understanding led people away from washing. However, soap-making improved dramatically during this period. Soap guilds in European cities refined techniques, producing better quality soaps more efficiently. The process became more standardized, quality more consistent. Marseille became a major soap-making center, producing olive oil-based soap similar to Castile soap. Marseille soap was pure, mild, and effective. By the 17th century, regulations mandated that Marseille soap contain only olive oil, no animal fats, ensuring consistent quality. English soap making developed around Bristol and London. English soap was often made from tallow, but with improving techniques. Soap was still expensive. Soap taxes made it a luxury item, but more accessible than in medieval times. The wealthy during this period maintained elaborate hygiene practices, though often not involving much actual bathing. They would change linen undergarments daily. The linen absorbed sweat and oils, and changing linen was considered a form of washing by proxy. They used perfumes extensively, applied powder to wigs and skin, and occasionally bathed fully. When the wealthy bathed, it was an elaborate affair. Water was heated, poured into a tub, often copper or tin, perfumed with herbs or oils. They would soak, perhaps wash with fine soap, then emerge and be patted dry with linen towels. Afterward, perfumed powders and oils would be applied. How did an 18th century aristocrat smell? Immediately after bathing, perhaps clean, perhaps masked by perfumes. But bathing was infrequent, monthly or less, for many. Between baths, body odor would accumulate, masked by heavy perfumes, powder, and frequent changes of clean linen. The smell would be a complex mixture: body odor, underlying various perfumes, powder, and the smell of clean linen. Wigs, fashionable in the 17th and 18th centuries, presented hygiene challenges. They weren't washed frequently. Powder was applied to absorb oils and mask smells. Wigs could harbour lice and odours. The smell of an unwashed powdered wig was distinctive, a stale, musty smell mixed with whatever powder was used. Common people bathed less frequently. Working people might wash face, hands, and feet daily in cold water, but would rarely fully bathe. They owned fewer clothes, washed them less frequently, and had little access to soap. Their smell would be stronger, more of body odour and work. Farmers smelling of animals and earth, craftsmen of their trade materials, everyone of sweat and smoke. The smell divide between classes remained stark. An aristocrat's smell, perfumes masking underlying odours, versus a labourer's smell, unmasked sweat and dirt, reinforced social hierarchies. Smell marked class as clearly as clothing or speech. In the Americas, Native American cleanliness practices often surprised European colonists. Many tribes bathed daily or nearly so in rivers or streams, even in cold weather. Some used sweat lodges, structures where heated stones created steam for ritual and cleansing purposes. Many Native Americans regarded European colonists as dirty and foul-smelling, shocked by Europeans' infrequent bathing and tolerance of body odour. This cultural clash over cleanliness standards illustrated that hygiene isn't universal, but culturally constructed. What seemed clean to Europeans seemed filthy to Native Americans, and vice versa in some respects. The 19th century, the sanitation revolution. The 19th century brought dramatic changes in understanding cleanliness, driven by industrialization, urbanization, scientific discoveries, and public health crises. This period saw the transformation of soap from luxury to necessity and the beginning of modern hygiene practices. But most importantly, it witnessed one of the most profound shifts in human understanding of disease: the discovery that tiny, invisible organisms were responsible for the plagues that had devastated humanity for millennia. Before germ theory, disease was poorly understood. The dominant theory was miasma, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air or poisonous vapors rising from rotting organic matter, stagnant water, or filth. This theory was partially correct in associating disease with filth, but fundamentally wrong about the mechanism. People believed you caught cholera from breathing bad-smelling air near sewage, not from drinking contaminated water. The discovery of germ theory wasn't a single eureka moment, but a gradual accumulation of evidence that required multiple brilliant minds, bitter disputes, and decades of patient observation. It began with the microscope. In the 1670s, a Dutch draper named Antonie van Leeuwenhoek began grinding lenses and building simple microscopes. Looking at drops of water, scrapings from his own teeth, and samples from the world around him, he discovered what he called animalcules, tiny living creatures invisible to the naked eye. He described them in letters to the Royal Society in London, which published his observations with considerable skepticism. Van Leeuwenhoek had discovered bacteria, protozoa, and other microorganisms, but he didn't connect them to disease. They were curiosities, evidence of life's diversity, nothing more. For over a century, these tiny creatures remained a biological oddity without medical significance. The connection began forming in the mid-19th century. In 1847, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis was working in the maternity ward of Vienna General Hospital. He noticed something disturbing. Women giving birth in the ward staffed by doctors and medical students died of childbed fever at rates far higher than women in the ward staffed by midwives, sometimes 10 to 20% mortality versus 2%. Semmelweis searched for explanations. The wards were similar in almost every way. Then a colleague died after cutting himself during an autopsy, developing symptoms identical to childbed fever. Semmelweis made a connection. Doctors in the teaching hospital performed autopsies in the morning, then went directly to deliver babies without washing their hands beyond a casual rinse. Midwives didn't perform autopsies. He theorized that cadaverous particles from dead bodies were being transmitted to laboring women by doctors' hands, causing the fever. In 1847, he instituted a policy requiring doctors to wash their hands in chlorinated lime solution before examining patients. The mortality rate dropped immediately and dramatically to below 1%. This should have been celebrated as a breakthrough. Instead, Semmelweis was ridiculed. The medical establishment rejected his ideas. Many doctors were offended by the suggestion that they, educated gentlemen, could be vectors of disease. The idea that invisible particles on clean-looking hands could kill contradicted common sense. Semmelweis's explanations were unclear. He couldn't explain what the cadaverous particles actually were, and his personality was abrasive, making enemies rather than allies. He was eventually dismissed from Vienna General Hospital. He continued advocating for hand-washing, but grew increasingly bitter and erratic. He died in 1865 in a mental asylum at age 47, possibly from an infection. Tragic irony for a man who discovered how to prevent infections. His ideas, though correct, were largely forgotten or dismissed. The vindication of Semmelweis and the triumph of germ theory came through the work of two men, Louis Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany. Their work in the 1860s through 1880s established beyond doubt that microorganisms cause disease. Louis Pasteur wasn't a physician but a chemist studying fermentation. In the 1850s and 1860s, he investigated why wine and beer sometimes spoiled. He discovered that fermentation was caused by living yeast cells and spoilage was caused by bacteria. He demonstrated that heating liquids killed the microorganisms, preventing spoilage, the process we now call pasteurization. Pasteur then turned to silkworm diseases plaguing the French silk industry. He identified microorganisms causing the diseases and developed methods to prevent their spread. This was the first clear demonstration that microorganisms cause disease in living creatures. In the 1870s, Pasteur investigated anthrax, a disease killing sheep and cattle across Europe. He identified the bacterium causing anthrax and demonstrated it could be grown in culture. Most dramatically, he developed a vaccine, a weakened form of the bacteria that, when injected into sheep, protected them from the disease. In a famous public demonstration in 1881, Pasteur vaccinated half a flock of sheep, then exposed all the sheep to anthrax. The vaccinated sheep survived. The unvaccinated died. The proof was undeniable. Robert Koch, a German physician, took a different approach. He developed rigorous methods for proving that specific bacteria caused specific diseases. Koch's postulates, established in the 1880s, laid out the criteria. The organism must be found in all cases of the disease. It must be isolated and grown in pure culture. The cultured organism must cause disease when introduced to a healthy host, and it must be re-isolated from the experimentally infected host. Using these methods, Koch identified the bacteria causing tuberculosis in 1882 and cholera in 1883. Tuberculosis was one of the greatest killers of the 19th century, and cholera epidemics had ravaged cities for decades. Identifying their causes was monumental. The news spread through scientific journals, medical conferences, and popular press. The British medical journal The Lancet published Koch's findings. Newspapers reported the discoveries, though often sensationalizing or misunderstanding them. Medical societies invited Pasteur and Koch to present their work. The evidence became overwhelming. Disease was caused by germs. But acceptance wasn't immediate or universal. Many older physicians trained in miasma theory resisted. The idea seemed incredible that invisible creatures too small to see, without microscopes, could kill robust adults. Some critics argued the bacteria were effects of disease, not causes. The disease created the bacteria, not the other way around. What convinced the skeptics was evidence and practical success. Joseph Lister, a British surgeon, read Pasteur's work in the 1860s and made a connection. If microorganisms caused fermentation and spoilage, might they cause the infections that killed so many surgical patients? Surgery in the 1860s was grotesquely septic. Surgeons operated in their street clothes, used instruments wiped on dirty cloths, and never washed their hands. Post-surgical infections killed nearly half of patients. Lister began using carbolic acid, phenol, to sterilize instruments, clean wounds, and purify the air in operating rooms. He required surgeons to wash their hands in carbolic solution. The results were dramatic. Post-surgical infection rates plummeted. By the 1870s and 1880s, Listerian antiseptic surgery was being adopted worldwide. The success of antiseptic surgery convinced many skeptics. Here was practical proof. When you acted as if germs caused disease and took steps to kill them, patients survived who would otherwise have died. The theory worked. Public health officials embraced germ theory eagerly. If germs caused disease, then preventing disease meant controlling germs. This required cleanliness, not just individual cleanliness, but societal cleanliness. Cities needed clean water supplies, sewage systems, garbage removal, and public hygiene education. The sanitation movement gained new urgency. Reformers who had advocated for clean water and sewage systems based on miasma theory now had a stronger rationale. Contaminated water didn't just smell bad, it contained cholera bacteria. Sewage wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. Cities invested in infrastructure. London completed major sewer systems in the 1860s and 1870s. New York, Paris, Berlin, and other cities followed. Clean water systems were built, separating drinking water from sewage. These investments saved millions of lives. Public health campaigns educated citizens. Posters, pamphlets, and newspaper articles explained germs and how to avoid them. Wash your hands became a public health mantra. School children were taught to cover their mouths when coughing, not to share drinking cups to wash before eating. The impact on cleanliness attitudes was profound. Washing wasn't just aesthetic or social, it was medical necessity. Dirt wasn't just unpleasant, it harbored germs. This gave cleanliness a scientific foundation it had lacked. Soap sales increased as people understood its importance. Soap manufacturers advertised their products as germ killers, sometimes with exaggerated claims, but with the basic truth that soap removed germs from skin. Clean hands, clean bodies, clean homes all became strategies for disease prevention. Industrialization made soap cheaper. Nicolas Leblanc's process, developed in the late 18th century and refined in the 19th, produced alkali cheaply from salt, dramatically reducing soap production costs. By mid-century, soap was affordable to working-class families. New companies emerged. William Hesketh Lever founded Lever Brothers in 1885, producing Sunlight soap. The Scottish chemist James Gamble and his brother-in-law William Procter founded their company in 1837, Procter & Gamble, that would become one of the world's largest soap manufacturers. In 1879, they introduced Ivory soap, marketed as 99 and 44 100% pure. These companies didn't just make soap, they created brands, advertised extensively, and educated consumers about hygiene. Their motives were profit, but the effect was increased cleanliness and public health. New products emerged beyond soap. Commercial shampoos appeared, and deodorants were invented, though widespread adoption came in the 20th century. Indoor plumbing transformed bathing practices. In earlier eras, bathing required hauling and heating water, enormous labor. With indoor plumbing and water heaters, running hot water made bathing vastly easier. By the late 19th century, in urban areas of developed countries, middle-class homes had bathrooms with tubs and running water. Bathing shifted from occasional event to regular practice. How often did people bathe in the late 19th century? It varied, but once weekly became common for those with access to bathrooms and hot water. The wealthy might bathe more frequently. Regular bathing, at least weekly, often more, became the new norm in developed countries. How did people smell? Dramatically different from earlier eras. Regular washing with soap removed body oils and reduced bacterial populations that cause odor. After bathing, a late 19th century person would smell distinctly cleaner than their ancestors, perhaps of whatever soap they used, but primarily just clean. Between baths, body odor would accumulate, but less severely than in earlier times when people bathed monthly or less. The baseline level of odor was lower. To our modern noses, they might smell slightly of body odor a few days after bathing, but not the overwhelming pungency of someone who hadn't bathed in months. Perfumes remained popular, but shifted in purpose. Instead of masking strong body odor, they enhanced cleanliness or expressed personal taste. The perfume industry grew enormously. The class divide in smell narrowed, but didn't disappear. With cheap soap and improving access to bathing facilities, working-class people could achieve cleanliness impossible to their ancestors. However, the poor, especially in crowded urban tenements without adequate plumbing, still struggled. Washing required carrying water upstairs, heating it on stoves, bathing in cramped spaces. The wealthy, with bathrooms, hot water heaters, and servants, could bathe daily if desired. Social reformers addressed this inequality. Public bathhouses were built in major cities, providing clean, hot water bathing to those without home facilities. These weren't luxury spas, but basic, functional facilities aimed at public health. Still, they allowed cleanliness to those who otherwise had no means. The hygiene hypothesis emerged, that cleanliness and civilization were linked. This had problematic implications, used to justify imperialism and racism. Western colonizers claimed their superior hygiene proved their superior civilization, conveniently ignoring that many colonized peoples had sophisticated cleaning traditions. Nevertheless, the sanitation revolution did improve health dramatically. Mortality rates, especially infant and child mortality, declined where clean water and hygiene practices spread. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and other diseases decreased. Life expectancy increased. This wasn't due to soap alone, but to comprehensive sanitation infrastructure. But soap and washing were important components. The germ theory revolution represented a fundamental shift in human understanding. For the first time, we knew why diseases spread and had concrete methods to prevent them. This knowledge, more than any single invention, transformed human life expectancy and quality of life. And at its heart was a simple practice humans had been doing imperfectly for millennia: washing with soap. The 20th century, cleanliness as universal standard. The 20th century saw cleanliness become not just desirable but mandatory, an expected baseline of acceptable behavior in developed societies. Daily bathing and regular use of soap became standard practices, and deviation brought social consequences. Advertising drove some of this transformation. Soap companies spent enormous sums convincing people they needed products for cleanliness. These campaigns were manipulative but effective, creating anxieties about body odors while positioning products as solutions. They also genuinely educated people about hygiene and the connection between cleanliness and health. Daily bathing became standard in the mid-20th century in developed nations. Showering, faster than tub bathing, became the default. By the late 20th century, many people showered daily or even multiple times daily, morning routines and after exercise or before social events. How do modern people smell? If following standard hygiene practices, daily showering with soap, clean clothes, modern people smell remarkably neutral. Immediately after showering, they smell primarily of their soap and any fragranced products. A few hours later, they smell of very little, perhaps completely neutral, occasionally slight body odor if sweating heavily. Compare this to any earlier era, and the difference is dramatic. A modern person who showers daily smells cleaner, less of body odor, than anyone from history who didn't have access to these practices and products. Even a wealthy Roman with all their elaborate bathing probably smelled more of body odor between baths than a modern person does. The class divide in smell has narrowed dramatically in developed countries. Rich and poor alike have access to cheap soap and hot water. Most people, regardless of income, can achieve basic cleanliness. However, global inequality remains. In developing countries without adequate water infrastructure, washing is more difficult. Billions lack access to clean water and basic sanitation. The easy cleanliness we take for granted in developed nations is still unavailable to huge populations. Cultural attitudes toward cleanliness vary. In Japan, daily bathing is deeply cultural, with sophisticated bathing rituals. Japanese people typically bathe in the evening for relaxation, separate from morning washing for cleanliness. Different cultures have different approaches to personal hygiene and scent. The environmental impact of modern hygiene is significant. Daily showers consume enormous amounts of water. Soap production creates pollution. The plastics used for bottles add to waste. The 21st century is seeing pushback. Some people shower less frequently to conserve water, use solid soaps to reduce plastic, or choose products with minimal environmental impact. The COVID-19 pandemic renewed focus on hand hygiene. Wash your hands became a mantra worldwide. Hand sanitizer sales exploded. People became hyper-aware of touching faces, doorknobs, and surfaces. This represented a return to the 19th century understanding that cleanliness prevents disease, applied with 21st century urgency and global coordination. Conclusion: the smell of humanity has changed dramatically. Our prehistoric ancestors, washing occasionally in rivers with sand, smelled strongly of smoke, sweat, and earth. Ancient Mesopotamians who could afford ash soap smelled slightly cleaner but still distinctly human. Wealthy Egyptians masked body odor with expensive perfumed oils. Romans emerged from their elaborate baths genuinely clean and perfumed. Medieval peasants smelled pungently of labor and life. Islamic cultures maintained cleanliness through religious obligation, while Christian Europe often neglected it. Early modern aristocrats layered perfume over infrequent washing. And finally, modern people with daily showers and soap smell remarkably neutral, cleaner than any of our ancestors could have imagined. But this history also reveals uncomfortable truths. Cleanliness has always been unevenly distributed, with the wealthy able to achieve standards impossible for the poor. This inequality was often framed as moral failing. The poor were dirty because they were lazy or immoral, not because they lacked access to water, soap, and facilities. Religion and morality were recruited to justify these inequalities, with cleanliness equated with godliness and dirt with sin. The discovery of germ theory should have been purely scientific. Microorganisms cause disease, washing prevents disease. But it too became moralized, with cleanliness transformed from practical health measure to moral imperative, and those unable to achieve it judged as failures. Today, most people in developed nations can be clean in ways that would have astounded our ancestors. Cheap soap, hot running water, and daily bathing are commonplace. Yet billions still lack access to these basics, and the judgment of the unwashed continues, now often framed through public health rather than morality, but with similar undertones of blame. The simple bar of soap in your bathroom represents thousands of years of human ingenuity, from the first person who mixed ash with fat and discovered it cleaned, to the scientists who proved that invisible germs could kill, to the engineers who brought running water to millions. It also represents ongoing inequalities and the human tendency to use even something as basic as cleanliness to divide ourselves into hierarchies of worth. Thank you for watching.